thought to be typically a 1 in 1,000 year event that you would get these temperatures. But the prediction is with a 2 degrees C global rise in average temperature, which we could easily see this century. And that could be a 1 in every 10 years event. So quite a significant change. Oh, something strange has happened. Quite a significant change. And you know, this is part of the reason why the BEAT program is around and why we do these awareness raising forums to provide insight into how people can reduce their greenhouse gas emissions and other environmental impacts. Oh, sorry. Is that somebody saying something there? Yeah, and it's why the BEAT program exists, which basically supports SMEs to basically look for greenhouse gas savings, and it provides grants to help them actually implement those. More details on the website for anybody that's interested. But basically, you've got to have you've got to be an SME, so essentially under 250 staff. A couple of parish notices. So just for your calendar, the next BEAT forum is going to be on the 9th of November. So it's going to coincide with the the big UN climate change talks in Glasgow that happen the first 2 weeks of November, and hopefully we're going to arrange it as a live event, so it won't be a Zoom one like this, but we'll see. Watch this space on that one, and then a couple of other chamber things going on. So on the 22nd, there's basically a launch of the latest quarterly economic survey. So basically sharing the results of 400 odd businesses that have fed into that process of where things are economically for them, and there's a special focus on international trade in that particular report as well. So link to the events page on the website where you can access to join into that, and also our latest salary and benefits survey is now live. So this is where we gather all sorts of information, and so not just on salaries for all sorts of different sectors, but also all other benefits that employees might enjoy, and it basically, if you're participating in that, then you can then get access to the actual results that are published, and you can sort of see where your business compares to other businesses generally, and to businesses in your sector and geographically. So now to introduce our speakers. So first of all, we've got Melissa Mooney, who's going to talk about environmental management systems, and then we've got Paul Neep from Archetype, who are an architects. He's going to talk about basically a proven system for delivering low energy and low carbon buildings. There'll be time for questions at the end, but please put any questions in the chat function, and the speakers will either pick those up as they go along, or more likely we'll even have a sort of 10-minute question and answer session at the end. So I'd like to introduce Melissa, and I will stop my sharing, and Melissa should be able to share her screen hopefully.
Okay.
Fantastic, we can see you.
Yeah, I've just got to. Sorry, sorry, I'm just trying to move. That's better. Right, it's just got to move my Zoom controls around. That's better. Right, good morning, everybody. Nice to see some familiar faces. My name is Melissa Mooney. My business is EQS Management Systems, and I support businesses with environmental and quality systems to ISO standards, environmental improvements and legal compliance. I've got over 20 years in manufacturing industry, experience in environmental management, quality, health and safety, food safety, working with ISO and other standards. I'm based near Malvern in Worcestershire, and I'm passionate about helping businesses achieve their goals and aspirations with management systems and good environmental practice for a sustainable future. Oops, sorry. So I'll go through business impacts, drivers for improving environmental performance. Why would we want to do this? I'll tell you a bit about the international standard ISO 14001 principles and overview, the benefits of this, and how you can use ISO 14001 to help with your sustainability and progress towards UN Sustainable Development Goals. So we have an impact on our planet. It's quite an interesting fact here. By 2050, the equivalent of almost 3 planets could be required to sustain current lifestyles. So it's clear that we need to make some changes and some improvements. And the World Economic Forum Global Risk Report this year stated that environmental threats are amongst the greatest by likelihood and impact. So you can see things like climate action failure, human environmental damage, biodiversity loss, and so on. So there's lots of challenges ahead for business. So potential impacts on the environment from business, things like pollution, water, surface and groundwater, so things like the use of chemicals, effluent treatment and disposal. I think George Monbiot last night was travelling down the River Wye, taking samples of the river to see what pollution was occurring at the time. So it does happen. Air pollution, nitrous oxide, sulfur oxides, carbon oxides, particulates, emissions from industrial processes, land, things like solvents, which very quickly leach through the soil and can do so into underground aquifers. Soil degradation through intensive land use management, biodiversity lost, habitat destruction, climate change, which Simon's just alluded to, global warming and changes in the climate, and the need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by half by 2030. I'm sure you've heard all of the net zero target that the UK has. Things like waste and mismanagement of that. Food waste is a big problem. Plastic, which has been in the news a lot recently. Electrical equipment, that's waste electrical and electronic equipment, and hazardous waste. Depletion of resources, water shortages. Water isn't an unlimited resource. Potable water is in short supply, so it's important that we use that wisely. Some elements such as lithium are in short supply, and obviously, as we know, oil is running out. Deforestation, so destruction of forests for agriculture and development, and increasing population. So we need to begin to produce food sustainably. So lots of impacts. So why should business look at their environmental impacts and performance? So a big one is legislation. The government is really driving this and driving improvements, and lots of legislation due to come in. The Environment Bill is going through Parliament at the moment, having been delayed. There's things like the extended producer responsibility regulations, which are coming in 2022. And obviously we have the target of net zero carbon emissions by 2050. So the polluter pays. Investors, banks and investors increasingly are looking at environmental performance, particularly carbon. They may require people to report on this for investment and in the future. And larger organisations are already required to report on carbon. Consumers and customers increasingly interested in and making decisions on the environmental and sustainability performance of organisations. So retailers, for example, are asking food manufacturers to report on environmental performance. And having worked in the food industry, I know they've been asking this for a long time because I had to provide them with that information. Competitiveness and efficiency. It's an increasingly competitive world for business, and efficiency is key. And reducing your waste costs, reducing your energy usage, reducing your water usage, all helps you to be more efficient and save money. And corporate social responsibility has a bit of a bad name at the moment, but there is an expectation for businesses to behave responsibly. So now onto the standard. An international standard, ISO 14001 for environmental management systems. It's recognised throughout the world. It provides a great framework and it helps you manage your impact on the environment. One of the requirements is to identify your impacts and also the regulations that you have to comply with. And as with other ISO standards, it's based on Plan, Do, Check, Act. And I'll tell you a bit more about this shortly. It takes a risk-based approach and it asks you to have a life cycle perspective. So your system can be certified by an external organisation if you want, or you can simply use it as a tool to develop an environmental management system for your business. So plan, do, check, act. I love this. It's a very simple process, but I really think it's helpful. Also known as the Deming or Schuett cycle. Many ISO systems and standards are based on this, including ISO 9001. And the aim is to continually improve. So it's about planning your business, planning what you're doing, having an ongoing planning process, understanding your impact, your risks and opportunities, and having a policy. And do, putting in place what was planned, so systems and processes and procedures. Check, monitoring, measuring, audit and review to check you're doing what you should be doing, and acting to take action to improve as required. So plan what you're doing, do what you planned, check you're doing what you planned, and if not, act and do something about it. Risk-based approach. So risk is the potential to cause harm, and understanding the environment in which your business operates and the risks and opportunities, for example, through your business plan and strategy, is really important. It asks you to be preventive rather than reactive, which is always better. It's better to prevent things happening than react after the event. And it requires you to have processes and measures in place so that you can anticipate, address, and mitigate risks to the business. And risks can be in the terms of ISO 14001 or an environmental management system, obviously environmental and legal, but wider risks such as social, political, technological, and economic risks should also be considered. So you could carry out a PESEL, for example. A life cycle perspective. So life cycle, stages of a product or service from raw material purchase or generation from natural resources right through to final disposal, includes design, production, delivery, use, end-of-life treatment and disposal. So ISO 14001 doesn't require you to have a full life cycle assessment, but it's consideration of life cycle stages that can be controlled or influenced that's important. And this is important because significant impacts may be outside of your core activities and your site activities. For example, use by a consumer. I used to work for a cider maker, and so how the customer disposed of or recycled those bottles was important. And also important is your suppliers' activities. So, for example, Apple's suppliers using pesticides or that kind of thing. So there's an opportunity to green the supply chain and to really influence your customers. And you can influence your customers in a number of ways, looking at packaging of your product to them, looking at helping them to design a more sustainable, environmentally friendly product. So there's lots of opportunities there. I'll just move on to the standard itself, and I'll just give you a quick overview. I appreciate the standards aren't always the most riveting of reads and can be dry at times, but I'll put this in plain English so that there's not too much jargon. So the first part of the standard, context, is part of the planning. It's about understanding the environment your organisation operates in, identifying your interested parties. So who's interested in what you're doing? What do they want and what do they need? What do they expect from you? So these are people like suppliers, customers, enforcers, local community. You also have to determine the scope of your environmental management system, where it begins and ends, what are the boundaries, and put in place a management system to meet the standard, including all the processes you need to do this. Leadership's important, and top management need to demonstrate commitment. And you need to have an environmental policy, which shows to the world what it is your goals and aims are. Planning, so actions to address risks and opportunities. You need to identify your risks and opportunities and what you're going to do about them so that you continually improve and prevent or reduce undesirable effects. You need to determine your environmental aspects and impacts using a life cycle approach and identify those which are significant. So for example, the activity might be filling bottles with product, and the aspect would be use of electricity, and the impact would be contribution to climate change due to carbon emissions. You need to identify your applicable legislation and other requirements. So these might be customers' requirements or codes of practice that you have to comply with. And you need to put in plans in place to address all of these things. And environmental objectives as well, so that you can continually improve what you're doing. Support, this is more of the do part of Plan, Do, Check, Act. So this is about providing resources needed for your management system to make sure it works, making sure people are competent and trained, and making sure you've got a documented system and records so that you know what you're doing and you've got evidence of that. An operation is about having processes in place to meet the environmental management system needs. So, for example, you might have a procedure to manage your waste so that everybody knows what they're supposed to be doing and it's handled correctly. You also need to have emergency plans and procedures which you train out to people and test regularly. For example, you might have a procedure which details how you deal with a spillage and what you would do to prevent that entering a brook or a stream or somewhere it shouldn't go. Or you might have instructions on what to do in the event of fire and how you would deal with firefighting runoff. So performance evaluation, this is part of the part of the Plan, Do, Check, Act. So this is about monitoring, analysing, communicating and reporting your performance so that you can improve. For example, you might have key performance indicators such as the tonnage of waste produced, the electricity you use, environmental complaints, hopefully you wouldn't have any, environmental incidences such as spillage, and you also need to check that you're complying with legislation on a regular basis. Audits are also required, so you can make sure that your system is effective and it complies with the policy, procedures and the standard itself. And also an overall, sorry about that. Gosh, jumping ahead. Also an overall review of the management system to make sure it continues to be suitable, adequate and effective. So it's doing what you want it to do. And, you need to change it if it isn't. And improvement, take action to correct non-conformances, i.e. problems, and prevent future issues. Continual improvement, so continually improving the environmental management system so that you can enhance your environmental performance. This is an overview of how you might go about implementing a management system. Obviously, the first thing is to make sure that there's buy-in from the team, that everybody's on board, and learn about the standard, or learn about what it is you want to do. Carry out a gap analysis if you require, an environmental review to look at the history of your site, or to look at the activities that you carry out to start to identify where you might have an impact on the environment. Look at your scope. How big do you want your system to be? The context, who's interested in what you're doing, and then evaluating your aspects and impacts and looking at which ones are significant and which ones aren't. Looking at your legal requirements, understanding your risks and opportunities, developing a policy and objectives, and developing your system in terms of processes and procedures, implementing that, training that out, and then auditing and carrying out a legal compliance check, and then a management review to make sure that it's effective. And then if you want to, going for certification, which is a two-stage process with somebody coming in to check and certify what you're doing. So how does ISO 14001 help you? Well, it provides a framework to manage and control your processes, maintain standards. It helps you improve your understanding of your impact on the environment and those impacts which are significant so that you can prioritize action. There's an awful lot of environmental impacts and it's hard to see the wood from the trees at times. So having a list of those which are significant helps you to determine where you start first. It helps you drive continual improvement. It gives you a structure to understand the environment which your business operates in, who your stakeholders are, their needs and expectations, and risks and opportunities. It's a structured approach to identifying legislation so that you have to comply with it, and putting in place controls and regular checks to ensure that compliance is maintained. So it really helps you to provide focus on what you're doing. So the benefits: competitive edge, reduced risks, you're reducing the likelihood of pollution incidents and prosecution, protecting the environment, improving compliance with legal requirements, because all the time you're trying to keep up to date and make sure you've implemented whatever it is you need to do, helping you become more efficient and cost savings through water reduction, waste reduction, energy reduction. Controlling what you're doing, your processes, particularly important if you have consents and permits in place from the Environment Agency, and they would require something like a management system as part of your permit requirements. Lots of opportunities, good for your reputation, helps you meet your customer expectations, builds resilience, and it's good for greening the supply chain and impacting on your suppliers' performance. So where does the environment fit into sustainability? Sustainable development was defined in the Brundtland Report as development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. So 3 pillars of sustainability: triple bottom line: society, economy, and the environment, or people, profit, and planet, as people like to call it these days. Makes me sound old saying that. And big improvements are required in social and environmental performance to achieve sustainability and remain viable economically. So I've put the bullseye representation here. I like this because it might be different from the usual Venn diagram that you may have seen. But I like this because it shows how the environment constrains the other 2 pillars and is really important. So the UN Sustainable Development Goals were adopted by all UN member states in 2015, and the target is 2030 to achieve these. There are 17 goals, and ISO 14001 can provide a framework for working towards these goals through your context, through identifying risks and opportunities, setting objectives for improvement. So they can be significantly incorporated within an EMS, particularly things like clean water and sanitation, climate action, life below water, life on land, etc. So ISO 14001 really is a good tool to help you take your business where you want it to be. So hopefully that's been of interest and useful. Hopefully you've got a reasonable understanding of the standard and where it fits into everything else. If you have any questions at all, I'll be very happy to answer them. Just give me a call or send me an email and I can answer them for you. Thank you for listening.
Thanks very much, Melissa. As I said, we'll save the questions to the end after both speakers have presented. So now hand over to Paul Neep from Archetype.
Hey everyone, I'll just get my screen up and running, hopefully. Can you see my screen actually? It doesn't seem to have shown up on here. You can see that, you can see it properly. Okay, great. And then hopefully that's gone into present to you. Great, perfect, everything's working. So thank you very much. It was really interesting, Melissa. Thanks very much. And certainly a lot of what we do seems to be a bit of an overlap, actually. So we do have the 14,001 accreditation, so it's kind of great to get a little bit of an overview of that, actually, because I'm not tend to be involved in that side of things so much. So obviously I'm here today. I'm Paul Neep. I'm Associate Architect at Archetype. As Simon introduced before, we're an architectural practice. So amazingly enough, I'm here today to talk you through our approach to sustainable buildings, and how we go about making sure that we deliver results as part of that process. So, first off, a little bit about us, but I won't go into too much detail. We are a practice based across the UK. We've got 3 locations in Edinburgh, Hereford, and London. We've currently got about 86 employees. Actually increased in size quite rapidly over the last year, and everyone starts to get a bit more of see the importance of the sustainability agenda, actually. So it's quite exciting time for us. We've got about 20 or probably more certified Passivhaus designers now. I'm not sure if anybody knows what Passivhaus is, but it's one of our key approaches for driving down energy use in our buildings, and I'll certainly go into a bit more detail as we move through this. And it's also worth mentioning that we are currently 30% employee owned, and working towards being majority employee owned over the coming years, and then fully employee owned as beyond that as well. So looking at making sure that our employees actually really guides the business forward. In terms of the work that we do, Archetype, one of the leading sustainable architects in the country. We work across a wide variety of sectors: schools, offices, public buildings, healthcare, housing. The key driver behind absolutely everything is that we are delivering the most sustainable buildings we can do. And probably about 80% of our projects are Passivhaus. And another key thing we do is to continue to learn and develop our understanding of our buildings, monitor them, and continue to innovate and feed that back into the process. In terms of our early roots, practice started about 35 years ago. Still doing sustainable design, but back at the time when it was a very hippie thing to do, so it's very much become more mainstream. Initially kind of started off supporting self-builds, housing projects and self-build cooperatives. So actually it always kind of raised this as it's an important part in terms of our background and the approach we take now, because it meant that we had to develop details which were incredibly simple to build and incredibly effective. And this is very much carried through into the way that we do things now, so that to enable to support to builders and clients and everybody in understanding the process and making it easy to move forward. In terms of what I'm going to talk about a bit today, obviously carbon in the construction industry. The built environment contributes to about 40% of the UK's carbon footprint, so absolutely significant. This is kind of roughly split down into two areas within the construction industry. So embodied carbon, so this covers the carbon, the emissions as a result of the manufacturing, transportation and construction of buildings. And then the operational carbon, which was almost kind of directly linked to the operational energy that's needed, and the carbon emissions that are generated as a result of this. In terms of how that roughly balances out, it varies slightly from building typology, but it's roughly equates typically to about 2/3 of the energy of the carbon footprints of a building is over the life cycle is from the operational carbon. So the electricity, the heating, hot water, and everything that feeds into that process. So that's primarily what I'm going to focus on today. But there's a little bit on embodied carbon, and that's certainly a separate topic. But certainly the way legislation and the UK is moving forward is very much focused on operational carbon at the moment. So operational carbon. As most of you will probably know, the idea of a kind of net zero carbon is for projects is about creating a balance, and this is a balance between the energy used or required for a building, and then balancing that against the renewable energy that needs to be generated, either through on-site renewables like solar panels or contributions to off-site renewables. So this is a very simplified diagram. Have a look at at that balance. Our approach is typically to obviously the basis that the less energy you use, the more easily you are able to balance that out. So driving down the energy use of our buildings to an absolute minimum means that we then have to kind of balance that out with relatively minimal renewable energy, which is pretty simple. In terms of, I mentioned before about Passivhaus and our approach to designing buildings. So just a quick kind of intro into Passivhaus for those who don't know anything about it. It was an energy standard which was developed in Germany about 30 years or so ago. And the intention was that it was based on a rigorous assessment on how buildings actually performed. So actually it could provide an evidence-based route to guaranteeing energy performance. And this was quite important to us because even as you can see kind of within 10 years ago on this chart, we were designing buildings that we thought were the most sustainable buildings in the country. And they were performing well, but they weren't performing as well as we wanted them to. And part of the problem was we were using rules of thumb, we were kind of working to kind of eco principles and things like that. but actually we didn't have that kind of rigor that we needed in order to guarantee low energy performance. So as we developed this, the 3 projects on the right hand side of this graph here show some of our first Passivhaus projects, and the approach taken to this is very much a holistic approach, and it guarantees the low energy performance to enable us to make sure that we were designing and building much more effectively. So just a quick overview. Not a huge amount of detail, but I've split it up into 2 slides. Firstly, the approach to the sites. So buildings, ideally, optimize the orientation. Face the buildings and the primary windows to face south means that you'll get optimum solar gain in the winter, and you will also be able to shade the windows better in the summer because the sun's higher and you can control them more effectively. So orientation is key. Obviously, north-facing windows, yeah, they're useful for daylight, but they do tend to lose more heat than they gain. And east and west-facing windows, again, they do have solar gain in the winter, but the problem is in the summer when the sun's low in the morning and evening, the sun can also penetrate deeper, so you get greater overheating risks as well. So this is all just part of the kind of design toolbox that we use. It's not necessarily a constraint or an issue to us. It's just part of the considerations that once you understand makes a big difference. The next element is about making sure we limit the amount of heat that gets lost from a building. So this is basically a simple calculation between the amount of volume of a building and the amount of external wall, floor, roof, effectively the building fabric where you've got the opportunity to lose heat. So the equation roughly works that the better the form factor, i.e. the more compact, the larger the building is and the less external envelope you've got, the less heat you lose. And this obviously enables us to kind of design more effective buildings, but it also means that we kind of focus our attentions early on to try and design sites and approaches to optimize building form, and ultimately larger scale buildings and more compact larger scale buildings will perform better. But we can make most things work, but it certainly makes things a little bit easier on the journey. The next element is about the building itself. So this is on kind of the more kind of technical design detail level of things. So a Passivhaus will need to have high levels of insulation that wrap continuously around the building. We often refer to this as a duvet layer. So continually wrapping around the floors, walls and roof, and in combination with making sure that we don't have elements of structure penetrating through that insulation if at all possible. This is often called thermal bridging. So the idea is that the cold can transfer through elements like steel or masonry through to the insides, and so when introduced into a highly insulated box, actually that can create different temperature differentials very close together, which can lead to things like condensation, growth and mold risk. So actually making sure that that's all taken out of the equation is really important, and a key thing about Passivhaus. Also, triple glazed windows. Basically, in a Passivhaus, the triple glazed windows, they are your radiators. You touch them in the winter, they're hot, they're providing the heat for the home, and they're also being triple glazed, making sure that you don't lose heat as well. So it's a really critical part. And then this is all topped off by having a great level of air tightness and then mechanical ventilation heat recovery. So the air tightness for a Passivhaus home is down to a level which is equivalent to about a ballpoint pen size hole in every square metre of external fabric. Compared to building regs, that's about a hole the size of a 50p piece in every single square metre of external fabric. So actually we need to make sure that we get rid of all the drafts, we eliminate the potential for air to seep through and cause problems, and then we complement that by introducing a mechanical ventilation heat recovery. So the MVHR draws the warm, stale air out of kitchens and bathrooms, for example, and then transfers about 90% of the heat from that air into the fresh, oxygen-filled air entering the building. So whereas most approaches to natural ventilation effectively just replace all of the air you've tried really hard to keep warm with cold, fresh air, actually the MVHR system retains effectively 90% of that heat. So it really makes a massive difference in keeping the building, keeping temperatures consistent. Another thing that we really kind of drew us to Passivhaus was, as I mentioned before, was about this this performance gap. So the performance gap in the industry is basically the difference between how buildings perform against how they were simulated to perform. This is an extract from a study that was undertaken a few years back by Leeds Beckett University, Centre for the Built Environment there, and so basically looking at assessing the performance gap across a series of homes. But this is pretty much the case across the industry. So all the blue bars here are effectively the dark elements are how they were predicted to perform, and the light elements are how they actually performed. So you can see in some cases they're kind of 100% worse, but actually the average was about 40%. But on the Passivhaus end of it, the last 3 bars on those parts of this study, you can see how close they were to performing as they should do. And again, this is the reason we went down this route in the first place. And this is also particularly important because ultimately, going back to that net zero balance at the start, just imagine you're trying to get one of these blue bar projects to balance out to be net zero. So you design it to expect it to use a certain amount of energy in its life, or in every month or every year or whatever. But actually, you could be 100% off in terms of how much renewables you put on in order to offset that. So this makes it a huge difference in terms of moving forward with achieving a net zero built environment. Other benefits of Passivhaus, obviously incredibly low energy costs, addressing fuel poverty for housing, reducing rent arrears, providing better quality of life, improving profit when it comes to business as well, creating a much better internal environments, removing the potential for condensation and mold growth, consistent internal temperatures all year round, and managed overheating risks. And as I mentioned, the MVHR provides a consistent, fresh, oxygen-filled air that can also be filtered for pollution and pollen as well. And also triple glazing provides an incredible acoustic benefit as well, especially when in a built-up area or a noisy environment. So again, without having to open windows all the time in order to get sufficient ventilation in a lot of cases. So Passivhaus is also a rigorous quality assurance process. So it makes sure that buildings are designed rigorously, and also as they're built, they have to be evidenced in construction in a much more rigorous way than building regulations. So actually, it guarantees that performance as intended. There are a variety of other benefits we've been raised as well, such as longer tenancies and shorter void periods, and then knock-on impacts to kind of reducing administration and legal costs, and then making properties more available when they're more appealing when they become available. And as I mentioned, really kind of meeting the climate agenda and being zero carbon ready. I think probably most people are kind of aware of the end game when it comes to the UK roadmap to zero carbon. I think it was mentioned again by Melissa before to a degree. Starting on the right hand side here, 2050 target for the UK to be carbon zero. I just tried to set out in a diagram quickly how the built environment or building industry is looking at, or how legislation is working in terms of moving things forward. So kind of working back from that 2050, by 2030 it's likely that all new homes would need to be zero carbon to allow the process beyond that point to upgrade all existing buildings. Actually, I probably should clarify that I reference homes a lot in here, but that's only because this future home standard has been developed at the moment, and the future building standard is running slightly behind, but is very much expected to have a very similar kind of level of sustainability requirements. So working back from 2030 is where the future home standard is likely to come in, and the future building standard at the same time. And this is also intended to coincide with the dates where no new gas infrastructure will be allowed on new developments. So actually it's intended to increase insulation and building performance, and also swap over to low carbon heating systems like heat pumps. And then just in parallel along the bottom is kind of where we're going with most of our Passivhaus projects in comparison. For example, in the past we've been able to use natural gas in those, but we don't tend to now. So we're kind of very much kind of at that kind of 2025 level in most of our projects with heat pumps, and in quite a few actually beyond that, looking at the kind of Passivhaus plus level with renewables as well, which is about the kind of the Passivhaus equivalents to zero carbon. So just as a quick comparison between where things are going to be, so this is only kind of 4 years away. Actually, is likely to be taking us in a direction where insulation levels are actually exceed a lot of the insulation levels that we deliver currently on Passivhaus projects. So it will almost become the norm from 4 years' time to deliver Passivhaus levels of insulation. And as I mentioned, low carbon heat pump type solutions will be a requirement. It's not a requirement for Passivhaus, but that we will be guided by that. So the main difference between the two is the air tightness, as I mentioned before, and the difference between that and the ventilation systems. And so it's natural ventilation still allowed for future home standard, and with Passivhaus we need the MVHR, which makes a massive difference to how the buildings actually perform. Kind of strip this back a little bit first so I could kind of explain quickly, but we worked out a quick notional 3-bed house study. This is bearing in mind that this is a house which is absolutely optimized to achieve Passivhaus, so the right form factor, windows facing in the right direction and the right size and everything like that. And then compared it between the future home standard and Passivhaus, and actually the energy bills of the future home standard home we're still looking at about upwards of £1,000 or more a year. A lot of this is because actually we're swapping over from gas to electric as well. So gas is about 4 times cheaper than electric. So unless you really reduce the energy usage, actually the energy bills are going to be going up for people. So people could be moving into these homes who have lived in relatively new building regs level homes before with gas boilers, and actually their new super sustainable homes are going to be costing a lot more. Whereas effectively the impact of the MVHR on the Passivhaus and the air tightness is likely to halve those annual energy bills at least. And also the discussion around achieving net zero carbon. Actually, this study worked out that the amount of energy that was needed for the future home standard home roughly worked out to balancing that out with covering about 100% of the south-facing roof pitch in PVs, whereas the Passivhaus home was about 60% in order to balance out the energy usage. And also bear in mind that this future home standard home is based on being analysed and built correctly and not having the performance gap implications as well. So actually, I think from 4 years' time, it was going to be much more attractive and much more kind of cost comparable to deliver Passivhaus projects. This is just a quick kind of example study I've also put together on kind of the life cycle impacts based on the initial construction costs through to the life cycle of buildings. And it's quite important because people often see an initial uplift for a better quality, more sustainable building as being out of reach. But again, this varies quite a lot from different sectors. But and in some places we're designing Passivhaus projects for cheaper than we are building regs level projects, especially where they're heavily serviced. But the idea, what I've taken here is a notional £10 million construction project. Say that there's an 8% uplift to Passivhaus, so you're looking at maybe an 800,000 initial uplift or something like that. But then you look at the cost of the running costs of those, and actually what you're looking at is a saving over the life cycle of something like upwards of £8 million, and a payback within 10 years. So actually, when you start to think about it in terms of a business case and the viability moving forward, this makes a massive difference. Again, I said I wasn't going to go into too much detail on the life cycle on the embodied carbon things, but as you can see, once you reduce the operational carbon down to the embodied carbon plays a much bigger part of this. So I'm kind of conscious I'm kind of very close to running out of time, or just slightly might have done, so just kind of whiz through this. But what we have developed is an embodied carbon assessment tool called Ecolab. This is developed by the practice. It means that we can get into the detail of where the embodied carbon is associated within the construction, and then have a look at replacing and refining that. Another key part of our approach is to have a look at trying to look at refurbishment first, if at all possible. It's a saying in the industry that the most sustainable building is the one that already exists. And the problem is, if you demolish an existing building, you're effectively wasting all of the carbon that's locked up in it, and then using the carbon again to build something new. So again, it can be relatively expensive to do a full retrofit, but at the same time, it's likely to be cheaper than a new build, and it's going to have significant carbon savings. And we also get into quite a bit of detail on the materials and how they can impact on things. So from the top end of this, looking at kind of polystyrene type insulation, right the way through to kind of straw bale at the bottom, which actually stores a large amount of carbon. So Again, this is probably a bit of a discussion for another day because I'm conscious I'm kind of going a little bit over time on this, but also looking at kind of bio-based and locally sourced materials makes a big difference to this process. Just to finish off really quickly with a couple of projects, as I mentioned, we're working across a variety of sectors and a variety of scale projects. Just flicking through a couple of headline projects. Just completed first zero carbon primary school in the UK down the London Borough of Sutton, and ended up with an EPC rating of -27. We've completed a couple of years ago Passivhaus Plus business incubation office, eco business centre in Bicester, part of the eco village there. And so this effectively takes it beyond net zero in terms of its energy. It generates more energy than it needs to use. We've also got a variety of housing projects at the moment. This is a social housing project as a pilot for Wolverhampton City Council, and similar kind of one for Denbighshire County Council at the moment. So again, all of these no gas infrastructure, looking at air source, or this one district ground source heat pumps and PVs. We've also completed private projects as well for private housing, and much larger scale apartment projects. This is at a 345 new builds Passivhaus scheme in London Borough of Camden. I think that's probably about it for me. I probably kind of waffled on really fast then to try and kind of wrap things up. But yeah, any more questions afterwards, please don't hesitate to get in touch.
Thanks, Paul. Yeah, I mean, we could probably host a whole day on the Passivhaus. Yeah, so we'll get the questions. There's a couple from Melissa. There's one here about, I don't know if you've read them, Melissa, but basically, if you identify an environmental impact that you have control over, do you have an obligation to eliminate that and report that?
Unmute. You don't have to eliminate, no, that the point is to identify them, to manage them and control them and minimize as far as possible. So putting controls to minimize the effects. For example, if you've got big tanks of chemicals, then having them bunded and stored and checked and all those sorts of things, training on the use of them, etc., will minimize the risk of something adverse happening.
And there's also one question: is 14001 certification appropriate to all businesses, and what are the costs associated?
I mean, any business, might be interested in having their environmental management system certified if they want to, to show evidence that somebody has been in and assessed their system and found that it's compliant. Then yes, it is suitable. The majority of people who have 14001 are manufacturers and slightly larger organisations, but I do know consultancies who have it, and it's applicable to any organisation. It depends what your organisation wants to do, and the sort of cost of that. It very much depends on who you get to certify your system. I don't personally certify systems. I would get a third party in to certify somebody's system. That might cost, if it's a UCAS accredited certification body, which is what I would advise. Ideally, it could be, I don't know, a couple of £1,000 a year. It depends on the size of your organisation, how many sites you've got, how many people, etc.
And I guess there's a fairly significant time commitment from, the part of your own staff, your internal kind of cost, if you like.
Yes, I mean, you obviously have to manage the system and follow all the procedures, etc. But they could be saving you huge amounts of money. For example, prosecution costs, £20,000 a time if you're not managing your legal compliance obligations. So yes, there is a cost, but there's also a lot of benefits as well and savings to be had.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, there seem to be a couple of questions around the kind of natural ventilation versus mechanical ventilation with heat recovery, Paul. So there's one about the energy consumption of that, because obviously you're using mechanical energy. And then there's one about, I think later on about, where are we? yeah, about relying on mechanical ventilation rather than sort of passive natural ventilation. Do you want to come back on those?
Yeah, it is a conversation I get into with quite a bit of detail actually with a lot of clients, and ultimately I think, again, I'm not sure kind of what point the questions were asked, but there are various bits within the slides that actually you can see the difference between the buildings with mechanical heat recovery ventilation and the buildings without in terms of their performance. The energy bills, it probably reduces the energy bills by about 50% or more, because you are effectively keeping all of the warm air in the building, instead of kind of ventilating it straight out, as you would have to do to provide an amount of ventilation to meet basic building regs anyway. In terms of the cost of MVHR, it does have a kind of a very small impact on costs. I think I can't remember the exact figures, but it was something like 50p a week or something like that, which, considering the amount it saves you, is absolutely ridiculous in scale. So that energy costs for the Passivhaus was obviously including the cost of the small fan that goes into the MVHR unit. So what it contributes in terms of the benefits is absolutely massively significant. Not to mention providing consistent fresh air to everywhere in there.
That health benefit, because my understanding is a lot of existing buildings in particular, so particularly in the winter, where you're not getting the natural ventilation because people have got the windows shut, a very poor air quality because you really haven't got that air change that you need to have good quality fresh air. So at the MVHR will actually provide that guarantee. As long as the motor keeps running, you're going to get that fresh air.
And it has kind of come to more to the agenda recently as well, because obviously a lot of health settings, for example, when they've got people coming into patient bedrooms, they've had to open the windows wide open and keep the heating on high in order to get sufficient ventilation to clear particulates within the air at the moment. And actually the mechanical ventilation system just consistently changes that air for you, and there's no cross-contamination between rooms if you design it properly. So actually it makes significant benefits in terms of the quality of the air and the kind of moving particulates out too.
And we're talking fairly low power fans, aren't we, for these kind of things on a domestic kind of scale? We're not talking high energy users, are we?
No, it's very low energy use.
Right, what else have we got? I think it's worth stressing as well that Passivhaus, obviously the name kind of makes you think of houses and homes, but it does apply to a whole range of buildings. What else have we got? Where are we? There's one about how many Passivhaus buildings, because there's this particular aspect of the guarantee of the performance. How many Passivhaus buildings have been built and or certified?
So again, it's not something I have to hand, but I would have thought across Europe it's going to be hundreds of thousands of projects. Within the UK, it's probably hundreds, and so, as you say, it crosses all kinds of sectors. So we've done public buildings, I think we've done a warehouse, we've done archive buildings, we've done houses, we've done schools and care buildings, and absolutely everything. There shouldn't be any real limitation to it in terms of what you can deliver as a Passivhaus.
And there's one here from Laura at Enmite. When we're talking about zero carbon, we're also talking about imported carbon. It means embodied carbon, I think. So is zero carbon all carbon zero, or is it just the operational carbon we're talking about zero carbon?
Well, this is a bit of an interesting subject across the industry in terms of where legislation is going. When I mentioned about the Future Home Standard and Future Building Standard, they pretty much, I think they 100% focus on operational carbon. So at some point we need to address the embodied carbon. As I said, once you reduce the operational carbon down to an absolute minimum, the embodied carbon is suddenly 3/4 of the carbon of the built environment. So actually, as I said, we've developed our own tool, and various others in the industry have as well, for assessing embodied carbon in our buildings. And we apply that to as many of our projects as possible, and then try and look at reduction. So embodied carbon does include materials and the footprints of how much carbon has been generated as a result of travel from those materials from overseas or anywhere. So using local materials makes a big difference, actually.
And it's also worth stressing that every sector is working to reduce the carbon emissions associated. So all those building fabric, the brick manufacturers, the steel manufacturers, the concrete manufacturers, they're all doing stuff to lower the carbon impact of their sectors, which effectively will also lower the embodied carbon of buildings, because you know, your embodied carbon is somebody else's first, you know, direct carbon emissions.
Yeah.
So, you know, we're not living in a world of isolation where you're just working on the operational carbon. Other people are working on the other aspects, if you like. And clearly with a fossil fuel based society, those currently are, you know, carbon impacts, but as they move to alternative energy sources, maybe alternative materials as well, you know, sort of more natural materials, like more wood being used, then clearly those embodied carbon factors will also come down, you know, for newer buildings as we progress. Is there anybody else got anything else you want to ask, questions or comments? Can't see any no hands raised. Nope. Well, thanks very much to both of you. That was really interesting, based on, you know, really interesting presentations, and I could probably ask you a lot more questions myself, but we're coming to the end of our time. So yeah, as we said before, the session is recorded. It's posted on the Chamber's YouTube channel, so you can go back and look at the slides in more detail through that, and questions, and cogitate, and by all means get in touch with the speakers, you know, directly if you want to ask them any questions, or, you know, something specifically related to yourselves. So with that, I think I'll thank you for attending, and have a good rest of the day. Cheerio.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
So thanks all.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.